Well, welcome back to another week of material text. I'm glad you all made it into the building without incident. I'm Zach Lesser, professor in the English department, and I run this workshop along with Jerry Singerman, humanities editor emeritus at Penn Press, John Pollack of the Kislak Center, neither of whom is here today. Neither is Lynn Farrington of the Kislak Center, because they're all in Berlin at the opening of friend of the workshop, Lilian Weisberg's huge exhibit on what is enlightenment. So I also want to thank Nick Herman for stepping into the breach to find some items from the collection that are on the table for you to look at afterwards. And as always, thanks to Peter Diamond, Brisdell Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Text, for making sure everything works smoothly. He's going to pass around a sign-in sheet, which those of you in the room who are careful scholars will notice is a different sign-in sheet than our usual one. It's an official European Union sign-in sheet. So please do sign in, because you'll help the research team prove that they have in fact been doing the research that they told the EU they will be doing. Good to know that the bureaucracy extends beyond the University of Pennsylvania. If you are not on our listserv and would like to be, if you add your email list, we'll take a photo of it and make sure that you get on our email list. If you're on Zoom and you're new to the workshop and want to see what happens in other weeks, you can go to our website, pennmaterialtext.org, and there's a link to add yourself, subscribe to our listserv. You'll just get a weekly announcement or two about the upcoming talk, plus the Zoom link. Just as a upcoming notice, next week we'll have Dorothy Berry of the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, who will speak about the digital collection of the Johnson Publishing Company archive. So that's next week. So we're moving from a 21st century digital collection of a 20th century paper archive next week to medieval manuscripts and scribes this week. Time moves quickly in material text, not chronologically. So today I'm very pleased to welcome, I think, our largest ever group presentation in the summer, from a team of researchers all at Charles University in Prague. And they are Lucie Doležalová, Jakub Kozák, Karel Pacovský, Martin Roček, and Ondřej Fúsik. And I won't take up all our time by introducing each of them in detail, but I'll say that they're led by Professor Doležalová of the Department of Languages and Literatures, who's an expert in medieval studies, specializing in manuscript studies, codicology, and library history. She received her PhD from the Central European University in Budapest. Her first book was Reception and Its Varieties, Reading, Rewriting, and Understanding the Cena Cipriani in the Middle Ages, which focused on the reception of the anonymous Latin prose work attributed to Saint Cyprian. More recently, she's published The Art of Memory in Late Medieval East Central Europe in 2016, and Passionate Copying in Late Medieval Bohemia in 2021. I like the idea of scribes passionately copying texts. Jakub Kozák is an MA student in the same department, working on medieval Latin and especially manuscripts and scribal practices. Karel Pacovský is an assistant professor who's published widely in medieval studies, especially focusing on convent life and the manuscripts that circulated within them. And Martin Roček and Ondřej Fúsik are PhD students who also work on DH projects, including this one. And the question they're asking is one that this workshop has considered, I think, in a number of ways over the years. Why do we stick to familiar ways of writing? Or prefer them over newer technologies of writing? So we might think of skeuomorphs, the little floppy disk save icon on MS Word, when most of our students have never seen a floppy disk, for instance, or the longstanding requirement that certain English legal and parliamentary records be printed on parchment, well into the age of cheap wood pulp paper, or the proliferation of paperwork, memos and receipts and reports in the supposed paperless office. So please join me in welcoming today's speakers, who will talk to us about this inertia of medieval scribes.
Thank you very much for having us. We are many, but we try to stick to 30 minutes anyway. What we would like to present today is a brand new project. So there are few conclusions at this point, many more questions, and that's why your input will be really much valued by our group. So we will really present thinking, primarily thinking of a topic that is really difficult to grasp. So I can see one of the possible results of this project, just concluding it was a blind alley and it's not possible to research that properly, but we are trying and we are at the beginning, so we try hard. The project focuses on the period 1450 to 1500 and the written culture of that period. That is a culture of transition, and it's a culture of coexistence and much interplay between the print that is already beginning to find its secure place and the hand copying still. It might be too early to speak about inertia at that time because print does not really present a clear threat yet. It's experiment. It's not like absolutely obvious that you should go for print, which is cheaper, faster, more efficient, because at this time it is not yet cheaper, faster, and more efficient, and it is also not available everywhere yet. So it's not the case that you are presented with a simple choice at the time, but it is the beginning of wandering. It's not yet the case that if you stick to hand copying, it's inertia, but it's the beginning. You are beginning to wonder, can I just neglect this new thing? And I think this is something we have all have had experience with recently, like with the artificial intelligence. When it started, you just felt like, is it going to change my life, or do I really have to take this into account? Now we know we have to take it into account, but there was this moment at the beginning we were not sure, right? With COVID, similar, with with teaching online, like, okay, are we really doing this? Well, yes, by now it is obvious. So that's why we are interested in this beginning period, because it's the period when it slowly becomes clear that this is something you really need to work with. So the basic question, as it was mentioned here, is why do we stick to doing things the way we are used to doing them, even when there are easier, faster, and more efficient ways to achieve the same goals? In this project, we want to approach cultural inertia not in negative terms. Today, when you look for cultural inertia, it will be very negative. It's like you are closed to multiculturalism. You are not willing to step out of your comfort zone to explore some other things. But if you consider carefully, inertia does not need to be negative, right? It means you go the path you know well, you get results you can foresee. And in this way, you save a lot of energy. So if you do the things the way you can do them and you know what results they bring, you save energy for doing other things. So if we always question everything, it's not a very efficient way of doing stuff either, right? So this project tries to be neutral about inertia and see where the sources shall lead us. We will approach the inertia of the manuscript culture in that selected period from 3 different points of view: the scribes, the texts, that's the contents that get copied, and the appearances, that's the layouts, the form in which the texts get copied. The scribes, we ask, who were the scribes who continued to copy by hands? Why did they decide to do that? And how can we learn about why, what were the reasons behind? It's the third question that is the most important one. I just listed few scribes that were extremely active scribes, and we have really a lot of information about them. They copied a lot, and they wrote a lot about where they copied, what they were doing. So we have really a lot of information about these people, what we normally don't have about scribes, right? Because they are not rich or intellectual or whatever. About these people, we do have a lot of information, and still we don't know much about their personalities, about their personal choices. So we can't really get easily to check their motivations. Similarly, there is not much explicit discourse about why you should stick to copying in hand rather than print. This is just one example, and it's an example of a mixed message, quite a famous one actually. Johannes Trithemius wrote a treatise, De Laude Scriptorum Manuarium, so in praise of the manual scribes. And he wrote it in 1492, and he praises how important it is also for the meditation purposes and how you, in fact, digest the text when it's connected to your hand. But just 2 years later, he had the text printed to get a wider audience, right? So again, what does this tell us about his motivations to promote the handwritten culture? This is just a small case study. I've been now working on a library, a metropolitan chapter library in Olomouc, which is really wonderful, rich manuscript library without a catalog. So it really deserves a proper catalog. Very precious manuscripts there. It's in Moravia, so it was not destroyed by the Hussites or not so much affected by the Hussite burning. So it's very, very nice. I don't speak about it too now. I just put down the scribes from the period we are concerned with, just to show you how little are people that we have documented elsewhere, at least as personalities, if not as scribes, and how some of these names are a little bit hopeless. WG, will I ever find out who that was? Or even Leonardus de Cracovia, that's the guy who also made the picture of himself. Leonard of Krakow, there were plenty, right? So it will be difficult to create a database of scribes and create profiles of individual scribes to identify them based on handwritings, etc., etc. We will try that, and we have already managed to create many connections, but it will be obviously a difficult thing. The same Leonardus de Cracovia, in the same manuscript, 276, wrote this note: Recordare Leonarde quanta passus fuisti in melancholiis quando hic scripsisti. So remember Leonard. So it's a sort of self-reminder. Remember Leonard, how much you suffered in melancholies. Plural of melancholia, you really don't find that. So it was big melancholy. It was so much melancholy, it's plural. When you were writing here. This is just an example of things we are interested in, and again, are quite difficult to interpret, right? So, okay, he suffered when he wrote this, but what does it mean? And we have another project specific about colophons and other scribal editions that we want to connect to the motivations of scribes. And Jakub will say something about it.
Yes, so the colophons are one of the important, and at the first glance maybe the most important source of informations for the personalities of scribes, and our project tries to create the database of this colophons from medieval manuscripts from the Czech lands. The colophons frequently mention not just the scribal names and other circumstances of the copy, like date, etc., but also refer quite frequently to the book culture in general, to the act of scribing, and to all the process of making the books. Yes, so we ask the questions how much the colophons can actually tell us, not just about the scribes themselves, but also about their motivations to the writing, about their how they approach their copies and their books, and so on. So when we look at this colophon, where the scribes write that he scripsit manu propria the text ad laudem et honorem Dei genitricis Mariae, so that he wrote by his our hand, and the intention of that was the religious devotion. So the traditional positivist approach, which was like predominant in the last century, would definitely like analyze this colophon as really like historical information about the scribe, tells us something about his intention, which is seeing the act of writing as kind of religious thing. When we look to other colophons, this notions of hand, of our handwriting is quite fragment elsewhere in rather formulaic sense, and makes kind of topos how that the scribes frequently used in the colophons. And so, for instance, in his colophon, but also elsewhere is like used this very pretty frequently. The notion of the handwriting is used as kind of sign of key for the scribe name. It's really very often. But we see also other instances, rather some funny examples, maybe some joke like verses where this notion of hand is used. For instance, in this one, when it says that it's written by hand, not by feet. Yes, there's often a notion that the hand is tired, or that the hand of the scribe should get some revert or something like that. When we look elsewhere in these colophons, for instance, the original like sense of this phrase, this per manus, is actually turned upside down, completely inverted, because it says per manus cuius dam, so by the hand of someone. Okay, obviously by the hand, but what? Yes, or the second example, it's mixed code, Latin Czech, says that it was written per manus chudého žáka, so by the hand of the poor pupil. Okay. Yes, and there's another type of colophons of this phrase, which is the group of colophons, and we know quite a lot of them, which say that the text was just written per manus, by the hand. So also, so as well, this phrase like loses its original sense. This question, how reliable the colophons are, actually goes along with like broader inquiry about the nature of colophons, whether they were rather like expressions of the scribal individuality, which is the approach that was really predominant and is still kind of resilient. But on the other hand, we might see the colophons as rather expressions of some let's say convention and some tried phrases we find in them. The repercussions of the first approach, of the positivist approach, to which try to find like some historical data in the colophons, is this rather famous one. What you see on the top of the page is the entry in this big collections of colophons from the Western manuscripts. It's transcriptions from the Oxford Codex, and says the nomen scriptoris Wilhelmus Plenus Amoris, so Wilhelmus full of love. And the famous catalogizer and codicologist Henry Cox, who made a catalog of the Oxford codices, like interpreted this Plenus Amoris as actually the surname of the scribe, of the villain. So, and there were also like other examples of this approach. For instance, other scholars try to see the English or French English name Fulala, which were just Latinized in this way, and so on. But when we look to to this collection of colophons. On other places, we see that it's clearly a formula at not surname formula, which has some kind of variation. It's not always Planus Amoris, but also Servus Amoris or Servator Amoris, etc. So we also like try to in the intention of the second approach rather see in the colophons the conventionality, the formulae, and are rather suspicious about what the colophon explicitly say, and it doesn't actually refer just not just in the terms of the scribal approach to their copies and about the intentions, but in some cases it is good to apply this rather reserved approach also in cases when the colophons provide us, let's say, some kind of hard data, which is the scribal name. For instance, this colophons gives us actually two informations about the scribal name. The first sentence says that it was written by some Petrus the Yelnitz, but the second verse tells us that the scribes was called Thomas Schlosser. So, okay, what is the takeaway from us from this? So, yes, we have to be like critical towards the information we find in colophons, but nevertheless we try to make this database. We use the entity relationships database Jurist, you might know that, and we already have like several hundreds of entries, and with adding some for instance paleographical informations, we hope we will be able to connect the copies of the names of the scribal names we know from some colophons to the other colophons which do not mention them explicitly, and other pieces of writing, and thus get some rather indirect data about how the scribal culture worked in the later Middle Ages. The architecture, the ontology of the database is designed in a way so that it be easily used and combined with other projects related to the scribes themselves or to the manuscripts. So I hope this will be useful for the project as well.
Okay, so these were the scribes. The second approach is through the texts. And there we would like to see whether some types of texts or some genres were more resistant to the print culture. It's already clear in some cases that that's the case. For example, the Book of Hours became quickly luxury items, so they persisted in manuscript culture exactly because it was so demanding and so expensive to produce them. So it became a sort of status sign that you could get a manuscript, nicely illuminated Book of Hours. But we are interested in other patterns, other types of patterns. Maybe some texts had more complicated layout. For example, musical notation, it seems. The first printed music is actually quite late, so it was difficult to get to print. And we would really like to see this more deeply. This is an observed pattern of a huge drop of manuscript production after 1470. It is interesting that the Olomouc manuscripts I already mentioned today follow exactly this pattern. So there might have been really something. It's usually explained by the later understanding of the print, of the importance of print. So then 1470 would be the time of drop, but it's certainly not the case for every genre. So it will be interesting to see a more nuanced picture of the patterns of production of manuscripts as opposed to or in comparison to production of prints. And the few cases we did were really showed very different patterns. The scribes themselves at this time are very creative and very unreliable. So another thing we would like to check, and what is possible now thanks to HTR, is to compare the versions, compare the manuscript versions and the print versions. In some case studies, we already know that the most silly version made it to print and got codified in this way, right? In some cases, there was more research behind choosing the particular version that goes to print. But still, again, it would be nice to do larger data, more comparison, and a fuller picture. And Martin's tool will help us do that.
So for that purpose, we developed custom artificial intelligence model, because there were certain problems when you try to use the already existing models or even ChatGPT, because as you can see in the bottom part here, there are comparisons of accuracy of the models, and the Scriptum one is our own developed. It's not perfect one. There are still some there is still some room for improvement, but the idea is, if you have to go through all the text manually, you can spend a lot of time to actually doing the comparison itself. But if you use AI, it won't be 100%, but it will get you somewhere. So the tool basically takes any transcribed text. You can use Scribes or any other tool that gives you the transcription, upload it to Scriptum, and then get highlighted the parts that are similar in some way. You can see on the video that there are some bars which are filled, and that shows you the amount of similar text in the whole book. Yeah.
Thank you. So we are happy to get back to anything during the discussion. The final is the manuscript page. So the late Middle Ages is the time of personal notebooks, and then the manuscript page often looks like this. It gets really disorganized. It gets sort of disrupted, really. It's been called the crisis of information management, this particular period. So it seems like there is too much to know, as Anne Blair says. This is one example. This is the passionate scribe Crux of Delch example. So it gets really crowded, really disorganized, really difficult to find your way through it. But is it maybe our table of contents? So this is not how you imagine a table of contents no, today. And again, it must have worked in some way. So, but is it true? Is the entropy of page, so to say, really growing towards the Middle Ages? Again, we would like to process many more digitized manuscript pages and see whether that is indeed the pattern, whether the page really gets disrupted at this period. Maybe see it again in a more nuanced way, that it was in the mid-70s rather than mid-50s or whatever. And Martin will be again instrumental.
Yeah. So again, you can use the traditional method. You can give certain pages or folios to academics, and then they should pick which one is more readable, and then you get some sort of scale. But again, it will, the thing is, it will be probably more accurate, but it will be time consuming and maybe kind of biased, because if you have some knowledge of how certain things work, for example, the calendar, you will find it more easily readable than, for example, some other type of text. And because of the nature of the project, I think the good way would be to actually analyze as many manuscript pages as possible. And that's, I think, again, a good opportunity to actually try to use AI. But in this case, you have to combine several different approaches to actually get somewhere, because for the first thing you really need to get is learn the AI to recognize the layout. There are several tools, but they are quite often limited, because they can find one column on the page and then the rest is somehow distorted. So there is still a way to try to actually train our own model or figure out whether there are some better options how to actually get it. Then you have to learn the model how to recognize if it's some addition, some marginalia, which is somehow related to the text, or if it's some illumination, because sometimes the illumination can actually make the page easier to read, but the computer will tell you, no, it's really hard because there's a lot of pixels going on. And then you have to also learn it to recognize headlines and all these different structures, so it actually gets some understanding of what's on the page. Then I think we would have to decide about the weights for each element, so we can actually calculate the entropy in some meaningful and repeatable way. And then in the end, I think it's again place where we should also use a script or some other model which will tell us if, for example, this marginalia is somehow related to the central text, and if it actually makes the page easier to read, or if it's something completely meaningless and it just makes harder to understand the page. So there are few examples of pages. On the left side, you have a typical medieval dream index. As you can see, it's one column, quite easily readable. On the right side, you have a more complicated text with a lot of or with some marginalias. Then there is a part in the middle which is somehow distorted, really hard to read. So yeah, that's it.
So as you have noticed from the examples we have used today, there is they were all from manuscripts from Bohemia, and there is a side aim of this project to make the manuscripts from Bohemia better integrated in European manuscript culture studies. They are frequently omitted, just like manuscripts from Poland, even from editions of medieval texts. People just don't find them. So we would like to develop further tools to help foreign researchers find their way through our collections.
So we are now developing a new web page, which is called manuscripta.cz. Maybe you know similar projects in Europe on national level, like Manuscripta AT for Austria, or there is a new web page for Polish manuscripts, PL, or Manuscripta SE for Swedish manuscripts. There are also other web pages called a little bit different, but for Germany and or the Netherlands. So we would like to do the variant for the Czech Republic and for the collections and repositories in the Czech Republic. We have many libraries and archives that have their own web pages, their own online catalogs, online libraries. There is not a single page from which you can enter them. It's also a problem. For example, there is a huge web page called manuscriptorium.com, which is run by the Czech National Library. There are many digitized manuscripts, but unfortunately, there is not really a system in this, and they also have much more libraries, not only from the Czech Republic, but also from different countries. So we would like to create an easy, user-friendly guide to all these collections that you could either search for a manuscript according to some features you need. For example, I want just to see illuminated French language manuscripts in the Czech collections, so you can filter it and find it. Or then you know that there is a, I don't know, Strahov monastery in Prague, and you would like to see how many medieval manuscripts are there, how many of them are illuminated, how many musical manuscripts are there. So this would be another function, just go through or to see how many libraries with medieval manuscripts there are in Prague or in Brno, or in even you would wonder even in some small places that there are some museums, local museums that own at least some fragments. So that's the aim of this website.
So, and also at the same time, we kind of feel it's important to make our research available to general public and larger audience, as well as our students. So for that purpose, we actually developed this kind of a interesting application we call Manu. Actually at the beginning, and that's how it fits into the projects, we actually did this for one of the manuscripts by Crux of Telch, one of the scribes we mentioned over here, because as you see, his pages are actually full of, full of informations where you can get easily lost. So if we can go to some of the folios. So that's we decided to annotate a couple of the pages where actually people can click, on some annotated parts of the manuscript and see what's being listed over there. The information is there, codicological, paleological, but also some textual information about what you can see on the page, just to make it available. This particular manuscript was a part of one of the exhibition we actually did about Crux of Tilge. And based on this, we kind of felt that it would be good to have a tool which would allow us to work with other manuscripts like this. And so we started Manu, programmed by Martin, and then we already use this kind of a tool for student classes, teaching students, and also presenting some interesting manuscripts. So if, for example, we just made another exposition which presents interesting manuscripts from the Czech collections, where you can actually see that some certain parts of the pictures are annotated. This is like a reader of major manuscripts in the Czech collections, and then the context is provided. And also this tool is supposed to be used by students in a new, innovative and easy way. So what we actually do is that you can actually use it for describing your own manuscripts and for using it for you as a teaching aid. So easily you can register into the thing, and then you can annotate your own manuscript, which we will show you on one of the example. So you go to the edit mode. Over there you have a page. You can decide to have several different layers. Over there you can say that one layer is going to be paleographic information, one layer is going to be codicological information, and by that you can annotate different things. And then the user then later on can actually you choose just for example one path or one information they're going to follow. It's very innovative and intuitive, user-friendly. So basically how you make an annotation is that you actually click one of the buttons. One, you can make a square annotation, and then basically you actually dedicate a certain area you're going to annotate, and then you, as in Word, you just basically write, you put it into certain category, you publish it, and then it's done. So you can use kind of different things. If you have like a different image which requires a sort of different shape than square, then you can also have it like this. So you can easily create a new annotation. Then again, you write the process, you submit it, and it can be published quite easily. If you're not happy with the annotation, then of course you have a delete button. So basically how you can use it is you as yourself, for your presentation, but also you can give it to students, as we did already. We give it to students and they annotated a couple of manuscripts as a result of for example, some research they could present at the end of a workshop.
Okay, we have exceeded our time. Sorry about that, and thank you very much for.
Okay, I'm gonna stay here because there's enough people up there, but the floor is open for questions. Those of you on Zoom, if you have a question, you can use the raise hand function and we'll call on you to ask in the chat. Yeah, Rita.
Thank you so much for this. This is just wonderful. I'm going to ask a question. It's really naive about AI, but I hope not about the objects of your. When I'm really interested in the crisis of information management in the 50th century, really interested in the incredibly messy page. So, do you give your system, your AI system, do you give them an exemplar of a properly well-organized, beautifully organized page? I think early, but Glossa Ordinaria, beautifully organized page. Do you give them something like that, or do you just have to start from scratch? AI learned what to look for in terms of a well-organized and a not well-organized page.
We are totally at experimental stage there, and we are collecting ideas on how to approach that. And there are issues Martin spoke about, but there are also further issues. So, for example, experience. So if you have the whole codex that is messy, then on page 150, you are already much better, much faster in understanding it. Or a good example, I think, is a calendar, which is frequently in breviaries, which often has different hands later edit. So it may look messy, but it's a calendar. It's January for one and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you can find your way through this very easily, right? And especially when you are medieval, then you have encountered this multiple times. So we, as Martin said, we will have to teach. So we will first see what the system tells us, and then we have to teach the system. But then, is there an objective truth about entropy? Probably not, right? So we will also, I plan to use crowdsourcing too, that I will just have medievalists voting, always comparing 2 pages and voting which one is more disorganized, to have some reference point. But even that is far from some objective reality, right? And we want to use the eye tracker too. So that's for the slow way Martin mentioned, when you really want to find out what is the linearity of the page. So where does this gloss actually belong?
I was wondering.
Yeah.
Next question, my follow-up was about
Yeah.
with a lemmatic commentary. So you actually have to teach, you already know what the content is, or, but the AI doesn't know what the content is. But to follow a lemmatic commentary, you have to know what the content is. And so how do you teach it to follow? I mean, you can teach it to follow rubrications, but you can't necessarily teach it to understand content. You're like a citation. So
But it can make content links.
it can.
right?
Yeah, it can. It actually can learn somehow understand the content, the thing that is said there. But you have to. Well, there are 2 options how you can learn the AI to understand, or teach the AI to understand the content. And one of them is kind of like unsupervised. So it tries to, you basically feed it with hundreds of lines or thousands of lines, and it tries to understand the content there, because you can, to a certain degree, calculate and predict if there is certain word, it will mean the same thing in the similar context. And the other one is that you have a set of corpora, or a kind of like database where you actually annotated which sentences are similar, and then the AI can learn properly what each word means and in which context it's really similar. So those are 2 options. And I think you can imagine it as if you are teaching a kid to understand what's something, for example, how to use Lego or some sort of toy. So it's the same with AI. You have to show it, this is the proper way, and then it has to try several times until it understands what you are looking for. Of course, there are certain things that AI understands the word a bit differently. So for example, if you give it a pattern that is common for zebras, and then you give it a car painted in the same pattern, it will tell you that's the animal, that's the zebra. So you have to be cautious.
Yeah, Ariel.
Thank you guys so much. This is, a period I'm super interested in, and a technological transformation that really, really interests me. And I think this work sounds fantastic and amazing. I have a question about this kind of crisis of information that you guys were talking about. Do you see the kind of messiness of the page as a direct consequence of like early print, or is that what you're trying to discover with this? What's your thoughts on that?
No, I don't think it's consequence of early print. I think it's consequence of the sudden rise of literacy, and also like it gets cheaper to produce manuscripts. So you don't. So I think it's more that these are really the first personal notebooks. So before, something like that did not exist. When a scribe copied a text, he copied for a community, for community use. And now it's like a new phenomenon that you write for yourself. And then, and I'm also a bit cautious about calling it like not so great, but which I tend to, because I see this table of contents and I just I can't use it
Right.
for the book. So I tend to feel like that's not such a great table of contents. But it worked. So really, these manuscripts worked. This Crux of Telch, we mentioned, and we worked a lot on. He kept in touch with his manuscripts. And when he, for example, often there is something he copied, and then he found a different version of it, and then he would be able to find the first version and write the new version on the same page somewhere down to the margin 40 years later. So obviously they are not as messy as they seem to us. So there must be a role of experience. They just found their way through them better than we do, because we expect order and system.
And that's not just like a personal, as in like my personal copy, I know where to find stuff, but you think that's like a kind of transcultural thing that like other people at that time could easily kind of find stuff that we don't see as clearly?
I wish I knew that.
Okay.
Really. No, because all these super active scribes so these 4 names I mentioned, it doesn't seem so much, but there is also Johannes Sintram, Kimberly Rivers worked on. They were each connected with some monastic institution, but it's not clear to what degree they copied for themselves and to what degree they copied for a community. And it's also absolutely not clear how their copies were further received. So sometimes in their case, we know their model, we know the model from which they copied, but we don't know any direct copy of their text. So they seem a little bit, they were really copying a lot. They were really maniac. And it seems they were really like happy to have the books. So it's not sure they allowed anybody else to use them. And then it's the end of the Middle Ages, and so then the print comes into the picture, that when they die, if that was 12th century, then the community would further use the manuscripts. But when they die at the end of the 15th century, then it's easier to get a printed copy than try to find your way through a messy book. So
let's pick up a question from Zoom, and then we'll come back to more questions here. Davida, do you want to unmute?
Yeah, thank you. This is fascinating. I think you've just been getting at my question in the last couple of answers, but that is, what are the situations in which there's somebody who has the option of whether to write it out by hand or print? Are there scribes who would have access to doing something in print, or would they have to go to somebody else? Are they writing under their own volition, or are they copying at the instruction of somebody else? So some of these, so I'm asking for some of the situations that you've described are, it's personal, and for some it's community, and I'd like to hear more of the spectrum of those possibilities.
Thank you very much. Yeah, these are very important distinctions we haven't mentioned, obviously. So there are scribes who write for themselves, but there are, of course, scribes, and there are scribal workshops where these people get paid, and then they don't get to choose what they copy, right? Somebody pays them, and then they do the work. So clearly the situation is much more complex than I described it here. I guess we are more interested in these personal, when it's like a personal choice that I have here something interesting, and then what do I do with it? But yeah, these are not the majority of the cases, for sure.
Is there another Zoom?
There's a couple in the comments. There's a couple of questions about the mono annotation tool. So Lila Goldenberg wants me to ask, what is the process of inputting text into Manu? Are you painstakingly transcribing every word into the program and then having AI analyze it? And then I was also asked by Pamela Smith if the annotation tool is accessible to the public yet, and if so, if you could remind us how.
So Manu is easily accessible, and we can actually share the link, where you can find it, through chat later on, or through an email. You can basically register, and once you register, you can already get there and start to work with it. If you want to upload your manuscripts, if the manuscript is digitized in IIIF, so there is a button where you can actually just put the link and automatically gets the manuscript there. The manuscript is actually, or the visualization of the manuscript is not in the application itself, so you're not actually breaking any licensing with that, because the holder of the pictures of the rights still has the images on their server, not on ours. So basically what we will have on our server is the annotations which we do over there. The annotations you put there are actually your own, so it depends on what kind of text you want to do, and if there will be some sort of a transcription, then you will have to do it yourself. That's the merit of the tool. But I believe that the question was sort of controlled with Scriptum also. So Martin,
Yeah, I think the part about the transcription is more about probably about the Scriptum. Unfortunately, Scriptum is not yet publicly available. We are still improving it, but then you have to get the transcribed text from other tools like Transcribus, Scriptorium, Kraken, or whatever engine you decide to use, upload it to Scriptum, and Scriptum do just the analysis, because it's quite heavy process to actually do the transcription, and I think Transcribus or the already mentioned tools do it better than we could be able to do in some meaningful period of time.
David.
Yeah, a couple of questions. Firstly, colophons, so fascinating. I just wonder how large or expansive they ever get. The most famous example, of course, are Armenian manuscripts, right, where the colophon gets so large it becomes almost an independent genre. Does that ever happen? I just wonder. And that's another aspect I wonder about. Does that carry over into print? Because the colophon, you think, is a very often you've got a lot of scribal labor and you want to sign off in some way. The printer doesn't need to sign off, but there is a kind of habit, isn't there, in early print of actually, I mean, why would you give the exact date? You don't need to do that. There is a kind of carryover of colophons in early print, which is fascinating. So that's one question. The other one is, I wonder, you know the work of Michael van Dusen?
Yep.
Yeah.
He's a friend.
I was just thinking in terms of the website, you've got the Wycliffite Bible there, but the work he's done on Richard Roller is quite amazing. And he did it very old-fashioned way, didn't he? He just went through lots of regional libraries and just went through library catalogs and discovered this great network of Richard Roller manuscripts. You know, this great cache of North Yorkshire right through the late 14th century all over Bohemia. So I guess you might save him some time.
So the colophons?
So yes, as for the first questions, yes, it's exactly as you described it, because also the approach which tries to see the formulaic character of colophons applies kind of structuralist analysis of them and sees the formulas as like some independent, smaller parts of the colophons. But for me, it's actually rather striking that the formulae do not appear just isolated, but that the colophons have rather cumulative character, that they really get bigger. Maybe we can imagine it, that they get bigger with other copies, which is also what we are hoping to find out. And the relation of colophons to literature, it is also it would be nice to do some deeper inquiry, because, for instance, in Byzantology, there is a notion of so-called book epigrams, which are described as short poems or texts in books or on books. So, but it really would be applicable to half of the colophons, this definition. So we can actually see, even in a space of Western Latin culture, the colophons as kind of genre of literature, and approach them this way, which is already being done in Byzantology and in vernacular studies. So it is also one of the possible ways how we can analyze the colophons.
It's actually, we are really excited about that project. We collaborate with old Czech specialists, because it's really, it seems really it works as a liminal space of experiment. There are so many neologisms in Czech, words that you don't find anywhere, that are maybe Czech. They certainly are not Latin, but it's really so nice to see how, you know, after you finish copying from a model, there is this space opened up for riddles, absolute paradox, grotesque, a lot of materiality. There is a lot of drinking, eating, sex, old hags often mentioned, etc., etc. So it's really Absolutely not only colophones, but a lot is going on there, and a lot that really makes sense to explore in huge quantities, because some things, as Jakub mentioned, they seem very unique, and then you find out it's a formula that appears everywhere, just you don't know it. So, and the literature until now is really like this. It's mostly like, and see, the scribe got hungry, and that's not the case. So it really deserves a more holistic approach, this space.
And there are many like tricky cases in a manuscript that we are actually not able to say whether these verses written after the text, after the colophon, are actually part of the colophon or another like other independent text that just follows. So it is, yes, it is also a matter of definition, how we define the colophon and when it's independent text.
That's why I suggest Armenia might be an interesting point of comparison in terms of their practice.
It's interesting what you say about it's an interesting comparison with the print colophon. That is it is a kind of leftover in print, but really I mean, and this is impressionistic because I haven't studied those, but in my recollection of English colophons, you really just get the data part, by me, Richard Pinson, a date. You don't get any of the other fun stuff. That it's like what's held over into print is very simple information, right? Not the materiality, the body, none of that. So I don't know why that was.
Sometimes where the print shop is.
Yeah, look, but that's important information, right? Because you might want to go, where you want to buy it. So yeah.
It's just like on that point, it's just funny that something that could be so personal would have these kind of little sayings and things that are repeated that seem so personal. This is it sounds like a great project to kind of discover.
Yeah, but it is again disappointing in this way that you feel like, okay, so where can we learn something about the scribes, right? They don't leave. This is like a great great chance to finally learn something about them, and then you find again and again that this is just the formula they take over. So.
Thank you so much for this talk. I learned a lot. I'm very interested in overlaps between manuscript and print culture in South Asia, India, contemporary India and Pakistan. So I'm coming at this from a very different perspective. I had a question about the first of the 3 sections you laid out. I was really drawn in by the advertisement for your talk when you were talking about the major question, what makes people hold on to technologies when there are more efficient, faster means available? And it reminded me, this is a comment first, but I promise a question is coming. It reminded me of some interesting work in South Asia by historian Chris Bailey, who observed one of his big contributions was that in response to a similar question in South Asia, asking why did so many people hold on to manuscripts in the age of print, he actually helped us understand that the social network of scribes, the social network and even like the materiality where those scribes were placed in communities was incredibly efficient. It in fact took a very long time for what was a pretty expensive technology of print to match the efficiency of these informal networks, which he called the ecumene. So I was wondering, to what extent does your project, if any, does it think about those sociocultural contexts of how, in fact, these apparently inefficient networks could actually be quite efficient?
Definitely, and really, as I said at the beginning, at that period we talk about, they were more efficient. Yeah. So this whole. So I think this period is mostly approached from the point of view of the gradual diffusion of print. So how the print, acquires more space. That's why we just wanted to twist the perspective to why do you decide not to go the direction, but it's really a bit oversimplistic. So yeah, that's a
Oh, this is fascinating. Follow-up, is it okay? I was wondering, to me, the fact that there are all of these apparently very unique, creative things that end up being formulas points to the fact that they're all being taught by similar people or institutions. So I was wondering, do we know anything about where people were learning these skills or crafts in the Czech context? Because this is always something I'm trying to find out more about in my context, so I'm hoping to learn.
Well, it's one of the challenges that many professional scribes were scribes of charters, and they were like at the court or at some other institution. And then, but then the difficulty is that then the script is very different. So it will be like probably impossible to connect the same Leonard of Krakow writing a charter and writing a book script. And we have a specialist, Hanna Pacovská, in the project who is doing the not the book hands, but the, how do you call the other hands, the charter and etc. hands. And so we want in the database of scribes, we want to have both the types of, and they are often the same people. Just it's very unlikely we will be able to say that this is the same person, because they just use completely different script when they write books.
This is such an exciting project.
I was wondering if you mix media, if you also look at printed or early printed books that have a lot of the someone made their own and into their personal notebooks, and they have their own writing for that, and if there's any insights.
Yeah, it's pretty frequent, and it's also really frequent to copy from a print in hand. It's much more frequent than I knew it existed, but it seems it was so frequent to take a printed book and copy for yourself. So yeah, we did only a case for Crux of Terč. We went through all the incunabula from the Třeboň library where he ended up in the Třeboň Augustinian Canonry, and we found his hand in 2 out of 170. And so, I mean, it seems like he really preferred the manuscripts because he kept writing into his manuscripts, and he did not write into incunabula. But that's just one case. I mean, there is a lot of material from this period.
Yeah, okay. So I have a question, a slightly different. This is about you're talking about the inertia of scribes, but I'm also wondering about, as it were, the inertia of readers. We have good examples of early humanist readers who are perfectly happy to use 12th century copies of, I don't know, some classical text, because it's a perfectly clean, nice text. You don't need to go out and buy an early printed book or have it printed up. You've got a perfectly nice Horace or Ovid or whatever it is right there in your library. And so I wondered to what extent that's something that comes within the compass of the kinds of things that you will address, but more specifically, what the kind of drop-off points might be in terms of the kinds of medieval copies that people are willing to use in the 15th century. So I would imagine that they would all love to have a lovely, 12th century text because it's nice and clear, but there may be drop-offs, later on. But I just wonder to what extent there is also inertia that can be attached to the habits of readers.
That's a great point. Thank you. Yeah, I did not think of it at all, but it's really a great point. So there have been studies also comparing the manuscript production 12th, 13th, 14th century, and in the 13th it was much less, and then they wondered because the literary culture did not go down, and that was exactly the conclusion, that the 12th century copies were so nice and the monasteries were well equipped, so they did not need to create a new copy. And it's the case until now, right? That we have nice 12th century manuscripts on parchment. They last much better than many books on paper.
Yeah.
So yeah, they were surely in continuous use. Yeah, thank you for this.
I was wondering about, thinking about copying from, I love, those cases we know of in England too, of copying from a printed book. Those are really in tension with that graph you put up that shows, I don't believe that can be as a result of, I mean, it's just too fast, right? It like happens immediately, but it does make you wonder if there's something about the 1470s or so that that selects against the preservation later, because these graphs are not actually graphs of the manuscripts that were
Yeah.
produced in those decades.
Basically.
They're graphs of the manuscripts that survived
Yeah.
dead from those decades, right?
Yeah.
So it could be that there's something about the diffusion of print that then affects the preservation of manuscripts from later periods as opposed to later periods. I don't know if that's come up in any.
Absolutely. And I have one more thought that I did not include, but I will share it. That also this graph is based on dated manuscripts.
Right.
And dated manuscripts are dated often through colophons or watermarks, but watermarks are also dated thanks to colophons eventually. So so these people who made the graph, they concluded that we have to see this drop unless we want to claim that the fashion for dating manuscripts in colophons faded after 1470. But it is possible, right? It is at least theoretically possible. As we see now the fashions of the different formulae, it is possible that it was fashionable to date manuscripts until 1470, and then it was not fashionable anymore to add the colophons. And that's why we don't have dated manuscripts from 1470s. And everybody told me I'm crazy, but in theory, it is an option.
I mean, just as a little comment, I think thinking again about copying from books, but also about the printed books, that is, but also about the whole shift. I think that it's very hard when faced with a new technology of text to really grapple with the transformation in this case, in like access. So when you're working with manuscript, no one thought it at the time necessarily. I'm not a medievalist, but you wouldn't necessarily think you're working with an economy of scarcity. But compared to print, you are working with an economy. In other words, if you get a hold of a book, you might want to copy it because you might not see that book again, right, in your lifetime. So you get a hold of a printed book, you probably still think that way, right? And it takes a while to really believe or to understand the economy of diffusion. So there's all kinds of cases too, and where Eisenstein talks about these cases where people, institutions get a hold of a printed book, they don't want to let anyone see it because that's the way you preserve books when they're scarce. The better way to preserve books when they're not scarce is to just print a ton of them and one copy will survive. So I moved offices about 5 years ago and I had a huge filing cabinet and I threw out 95% of what was in the filing cabinet because it was all printed out articles from JSTOR. Because early on I didn't quite understand that I could always just go get that article online. It just seemed like, oh, I should print that because I want to have the article. Now there's a new way of getting it, but it didn't change the way that I wanted to interact with it. And I think there's something like that happening with the transition to print, that early on, you just you can't reckon with how many books there will be.
Yeah, exactly. And that really shows the way you think that too, that the comparison with today is not so exaggerated, right? So we have also our professors who I tell them, they ask me for my new book and I say, I send you PDF and no, give me. So there is insistence on the materiality of the book, even now when it obviously is faster, cheaper, and more efficient to have open access to access it online. So it's not so stretched, the parallel.
Yeah, David, we'll have maybe one more question.
Okay. Yeah, just a question about German language manuscripts of Bohemian provenance, which is always a big question in Czech studies, isn't it? I guess after the Hussite reform, there are probably fewer of them being generated anyway. But in the earlier period, of course, there's equal numbers of German and Czech writings going on in the earlier 14th century. It's a very mixed linguistic milieu. Does your project include German language writings of the?
Of course, but
It started in the early 14th century, I think.
Yeah, for the colophon, there is some German, but not terribly much. So there is something after etc. There is sometimes Punchu or Rindfleisch. And so again, it's sort of obscure words. But of course, we take every language, we really take what we have.
Well,
Don't avoid German.
I think we should conclude there. We do have some great manuscripts on the table to look at. I don't know if there's any exciting colophons about drinking or eating. But please